I'm David Ainsworth, Head of Communications for the United Nations Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're coming to you right from the middle of the negotiations here in Geneva, where the world's governments are discussing the science and policy needed to bend the curve on biodiversity loss and help us restore balance with nature by the middle of this century. So as you might remember from our previous talks, the governments here are discussing science, they're discussing policy, and they're discussing a global plan. There are 3 meetings taking place at the same time. Let me give you a sense of what the delegates have done of the last 3 days to advance in these 3 realms. The first body of the convention is known by the acronym SBSTA or SBSTA. Now, this is a science body. Governments look at what science do we need to make sure that we're moving forward and doing the right thing to protect biodiversity. So over the last 2 days, governments looked at 2 questions, the question of health and biodiversity and the question of the soils under our feet and biodiversity. Governments met together and talked about, first of all, health. And in this particular area, they're saying, how do we make sure that we can protect human health, the health of animals, and the health of the ecosystems around us in a coordinated way? It requires a big policy plan. It requires governments to work together at the global level and then implement things at national levels. Governments talked about this plan, have some changes to propose, and they'll continue those discussions tonight. In fact, behind me, that's what those discussions are about, is about health and biodiversity. The second issue they talked about was the question of soil biodiversity. The soils on our planet, those nice, big, rich soils, whether you have it in your garden or they're in the fields that grow our food, they're the basis for life on Earth. So there's a plan that's under review by the governments that will say, how do we make sure we preserve that biodiversity? Governments talked about that last night, and they'll continue to approve that action plan tonight. The second issue for these governments is the question of policy, or policy that helps us get things done. It's known as implementation. So the subsidiary body in implementation, or SBI, is talking now about some of those ways to move forward. Over the last 2 days, they've been talking about what are called review mechanisms. What that means is when governments sit down and have to think about how did I accomplish my goals under the convention, what are the benchmarks, what are the goalposts, what are the measurements that we set up against so that they can know if they're doing the right thing. So the review mechanisms are fairly complex now. They're about the strategies governments do, they're about the reporting formats, and they're also about how do we make sure that when we do this new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we're able to record and report in a way so that we can correct the mistakes we make and do better moving on forward. Those discussions took place last night. They're taking place again. In fact, they're taking place just over here in a room this direction, and they're moving forward. So the third part of the meetings here in Geneva is probably the grandest of all prizes, and these are the discussions for the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So this working group has to come up with a global plan that contains goals, milestones, targets, supporting mechanisms, and it has to come up with them in a way that means we have a global plan, but one that fits together all the specific issues that every country in the world has. It's a tall order. Governments have discussed this online for 2 years. They've met in Zoom meetings, they've shared papers electronically, and now they're meeting together for the first time face-to-face in well over 2 years. They're discussing something called the first draft, which is a text that they've looked at. They've added suggestions. They've made it full of a lot of good ideas. And so here today, they've got to take those ideas and bring them together, simplify them, make the sentences simpler, make sure that all the ideas make sense together. So the working group did really 3 different things over the last few days. So first of all, they looked at the goals and the milestones. So the goals are the big questions about what do we really want to achieve over 10 years. They looked at those. They looked at the milestones. Are there some interim steps that we can achieve? Not all governments were sure that milestones were a good idea. Then governments started to look at the targets. They looked at the first 8 targets. And the first 8 targets, they talk about how do you protect biodiversity? How do you make sure the threats are gone? Then they talked about the next 5 targets, 9 through 13. And those are the targets which are about how do we make sure that while we protect biodiversity, we're letting people use it sustainably and fulfill their well-being. This means making sure that we have the food and clothing and well-being from biodiversity without harming it. Governments talked about those texts, they came up with new ideas, but they'll continue to talk about them over the next few days. Take a look at the discussions, follow the news reports that come out, and we'll come back with Biodiversity Beat news reviews and tell you what's developed over the next few days. I'm David Ainsworth.